everyone with an interest in NASH, or more broadly, fatty liver disease, Surf's Up, Season 2, Episode 54. Our coverage and remembrance of last week's Patient-Focused Drug Development meeting starts now.
This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
Terri describes going to surgery and decompensating very quickly. Is there any excuse with the technologies and non-invasive methods we have today for anybody to go to surgery without knowing whether that person is cirrhotic?
We know that people with hope strive harder to do the things they can. So if hope gets people to take better care of themselves while using medications that aren't working that well, but have a hope for something to come up, hope in itself is huge.
At this point in time, it's not even about a cure. It's just to have something in hand that we can hand to somebody and say, with lifestyle modification and this, that will stop the progression and maybe even reverse it.
I think the FDA is trying to do a great job. They're trying to do drug development in such a way that they minimize risk. But what we also need is to maximize benefit. And there is a happy medium. The enemy of good is great. Do we need great? No, we need something.
This is the beginning of a new era for liver health, hopefully for liver research and investment in liver research, because that patient voice, that patient accountability, that patient scrutiny and proactive response and partnership, should the agency take advantage of that, and I think they will.
Every week, a global community of fatty liver disease stakeholders comes together to explore the most important challenges in diagnosing, treating, and developing medications for patients with fatty liver diseases. Join hepatology researcher and key opinion leader Dr. Stephen Harrison, liver wellness advocate Louise Campbell, pricing and forecasting guru Roger Green, and this week's guests, Global Liver Institute President and CEO Donna Cryer, and patient advocate Terri Milton, as they discuss last week's groundbreaking patient-focused drug development meeting. This week on Surfing the NASH Tsunami.
So last week's Patient-Focused Drug Development event was sponsored by Global Liver Institute in collaboration with FDA, and it was really something unique. Donna Cryer is with us today. The band is back together. Donna's here, and she'll be able to talk about it. And we're also fortunate to have with us Terri Milton, who was one of the people who testified at the event. And then, of course, Louise is here and Stephen is here. For once, Louise has worse soccer wounds to lick than I do, so I guess that's a good thing if you're me, but that would be about it. We're not going to do a lot of introduction because I think this meeting speaks for itself, and I can pick up everything we need on the back end. Let me start by introducing Terri and inviting Terri, as people normally do on the first time. Tell us a little bit about how you got here. Take a little more time than the 2 minutes we usually give folks, because I'd like you to talk some about the history of the disease, share some of the facts that you shared at last Thursday's meeting, so folks have an understanding of how painfully you've earned your right to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Roger. I can tell you that there is no way that I thought I would ever be here today. And I mean that literally and figuratively in all the other ways. In 1998, when I was first diagnosed with fatty liver, after doing something as simple as giving blood to the American Red Cross and getting a little postcard that says, by the way, your liver enzymes are high. And so when you start there and your doctor says, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal. Everybody has fatty liver at some point in time. And 19 years later, almost 20, finding out that not only has it advanced to cirrhosis, but the cause was something called NASH, which at the time I had never ever heard of. There was a lot of different things in between, a lot of misdiagnosis that had happened. I was diagnosed with lupus. I was diagnosed with pancreatitis. I was diagnosed with a lot of different other itises through the years. Cirrhosis was not on the horizon of what I thought would happen. And the main reason being is that I was under the perception that cirrhosis was something that only someone with alcohol drinking would have. And I didn't drink. Occasional every once in a while. The every once in a while was maybe once every 3 years or so. It was not something that I did on a regular basis. So I went immediately from what's considered compensated cirrhosis, which is no symptoms whatsoever, to within days having full decompensation of my liver. And that meant that within 8 days after my surgery, as I had gallbladder surgery, that's what found the original cirrhosis and NASH, I had gained 40 pounds in weight. And it was all due to this fluid called ascites. I didn't know what what that was. And within another month, as I had my first hepatic encephalopathy episode. Now, I'm a communicator. I create and design classes to teach adults. I enjoy doing that. As Donna has gotten to meet me through the years, as she knows I'm a storyteller, and I know how to pull a story to illustrate something that people are going to understand. But when you have hepatic encephalopathy, those things go out. And I guess the reality of that came to a point when I was a block from home and got lost. And then you try to figure out how to use your cell phone and don't know where the emojis are, or even how to push buttons, or even if you can hold your phone because your hands are shaking so bad. And all those things were going on, and then find out that I have varices, and it goes on as far as the number of things. And then in 2018, being diagnosed with HCC, hepatocellular carcinoma. And all I know is that every time that I went to go find out a little bit more about what was going on with me, there was no information available. Not anything that didn't say I was going to die within weeks or months. But it was daunting because all of a sudden Dr. Google was lying to me. He didn't know what to do, or she didn't, depending on how you want to call Dr. Google. But I have since found out that they failed medical school and they're not a reliable source of information.
So, Terri, I think I mentioned this to you when we talked before, but the way this turned in from a 3 to 4 week podcast on clinical trials to what it wound up becoming had a lot to do with two patients who consulted with Dr. Google and wanted to know from Dr. Harrison over the internet where they were going to die quickly. So that's not an uncommon experience.
Terri, I wish I would have seen you in 2016 when I retired from the Army and had my own practice here in town, because, oh boy, this liver disease has been my passion for the better part of 2 decades. The managing the HCC part, it sounds like, when listening to the earlier testimony, it sounds like you got that treated pretty quickly and aggressively. So that was the good news, and the fact that you're still on the transplant list obviously means that it was treated effectively as well. That's good news for you. But your story is one that is important because too often surgeons do what we call a peek and shriek. That means they open you up and take a look and see a shrunken nodular liver, let out a shout, usually throw something across the OR, and then sew you back up without doing anything. And the reason for that is very simply cirrhotic patients are at increased risk of decompensation when abdominal surgeries are performed. And that's exactly what happened to you. You had surgery and then your liver was left trying to carry an extra load, not only in metabolizing your medications you took for sedation, but also just the extra hit of recovering from a surgery like that. And very classically, you presented with what usually is the first presenting symptom, which is ascites, followed by hepatic encephalopathy and then varices. So you've kind of got the whole story. I mean, from stem to stern, yin to yang, beginning to end, alpha and omega. I just hope and pray that it ends successfully for you with a transplant.
And I realize, even with a transplant, that there's a responsibility that I have to make sure that this doesn't carry on. I am a Hispanic female, so I'm half Hispanic. My father is Hispanic. My brother grew up in Indiana. And I know that the incidence is higher. I have an aunt who died of cirrhosis that was considered cryptogenic. That was 10 years ago. So I have a feeling that if we looked at her today, is she would have NASH. So there are some things that I know going into transplant that I have the responsibility. And it's going to be up to me with a team that takes care of me and that I take care of me as well.
Absolutely. I don't know if Donna knows anything about transplant. Just saying. She probably can share with you some pearls. But I have to tell you a funny story when you mentioned Google. A dear friend of mine and many on this podcast is Scott Friedman, and he has a coffee mug that I don't remember the exact words, but it's something like, don't confuse your Google degree with my medical degree. Yeah.
So with that as an introduction, I want to go back to a little more what we normally do, and then we'll have more time to talk about Terri's story as we go through the conference and some of of the moments of the day. Just spoiler alert, Donna did get to deliver a different version of her thing to Vlad, brought to you from a year and a half ago about when you're dead, you're dead. In this case, I think it was about medications. But every time this subject comes up, Louise raises that comment. So I just wanted to beat her to it for once. So Terri, I'd ask you to bring with you one fact that we wouldn't know about you if you didn't tell us, and help us out. What you got?
I am an adventure junkie. I used to rappel and rock climb. And by rappelling, I'm talking free rappel, is face down going down the cliff. I had fun. There's still some things that I want to do. In fact, as second liver anniversary is I plan to jump out of a plane. I love that. My husband doesn't know how in the world he found me because he's not an adventure junkie. So that's what I enjoy doing.
So have you prodded him, or do you solo on this stuff?
I'm going to have to solo.
Mm-hmm.
Well, being from the Army, I never wanted to jump out of a perfectly good airplane.
That's exactly the line I was thinking of.
Kudos to you for that. Maybe we could link you with some Halo guys from the Army, and you could jump with some Halo experts from 20,000 feet, free fall for the first 15,000. Yeah. Do your arms out, like this. And
High altitude, low open.
There you go.
Yeah, totally.
I think on that invitation, we're all
She's ready. She's ready.
Some of us might not.
Part of my tips for keeping your transplant for 27 years is not jumping out of your plane or anything like that. I scare my surgeons enough doing weighted abdominal crunches. So
Stephen, I think that means you only need to get a reservation for 2. Louise and Terri will be on it, and the rest of us will applaud from the ground.
We got to see what we can do. I mean, I figure if universities can get planes to fly over their football stadium, surely the Global Liver Institute can pull off a high altitude, low open jump. I'm sure you have connections on Capitol Hill that probably extend across the river over to the Pentagon, and from there it's just one small step to the Army chief, and you probably have an open door policy there, Donna. You just walk right in.
It's entirely possible. On a serious note, and the fact that is sort of true, several of the staff were giving their own personal tributes to a loss of General Colin Powell and his funeral services being on Saturday, and just talking about, those of us who've had privilege and blessing of personal interactions with him, just what a true statesman, a true gentleman that he was, and how he will be missed, and everything that he stood for, even if you didn't agree with his political policies, but everything he stood for as a person, as a man, as a leader was very special. So yeah, we could probably find a helicopter somewhere. We probably know some folks who can get a helicopter.
This may be the most unique start we've had to an episode in some time, maybe ever. But with that, why don't we just go to Icebreaker, and then we'll go back to kind of where we were. For each of you, one good thing that's happened in the last week.
Oh, I'll jump in. FibroScanned lists 5 days out of 7 last week, so we did really well. Some interesting sessions from semi-pro footballers. We've had a high-profile football or soccer, for you, Stephen, person diagnosed with a liver condition that's 2 years ago that's now requiring liver transplant. So it's raising the profile of liver disease amongst sporting elite, which isn't a bad thing. Yes, so we had a lot of interest, and I will break down those figures. They're not all as healthy as you think they might be. It was an interesting week for us last week. He's come out of the press. It was Ipswich football time, Kieran Dyer, who played for England, who's got primary sclerosing cholangitis, and he's black. So we have a real awareness that liver disease can affect people of different ethnicity, that is not alcohol related. And from what Terri was saying early on, it really is important that we look for cases like this, that he'll have had multiple liver function tests during his career as a football player to monitor his health. Yet by moving from diagnosis to transplant listing within 2 years, and I don't know the case personally, I'm just reading what's been released, that means there was quite a lot of severe disease, as we all know, before he was diagnosed. So looking for liver health in different ways is really, really important. Just on the back of what Terri was saying, her story is why we want people to listen to this podcast. It is why we want everybody who's a physician or a nurse or an advocate to listen to why you do what you do. Is for cases like Terri and the others, that we don't miss those opportunities, but that we develop drugs that are targeted in the way they need to be. So stay listening, listen to these episodes, and really get personally involved with the story, because actually it could be any one of us. We have to own it and we have to share it. But we've had that raising of profile trial in the last 7 to 10 days, really, in the UK.
Incidentally, that soccer player probably has IBD as well.
Yeah. That sounds right.
Absolutely. So that story is so important because a lot of physicians don't even think that people of color can get rare liver diseases like PBC and PSC. The picture that they have in their head is this middle-aged Caucasian, often woman in the case of PBC or man in the case of PSC. Just the fact that he has it, and so grateful that he's being open with his story so that others can learn from it, and hopefully both patients and physicians will both take another look, be more careful, screen earlier, allow for the possibility that the person in front of them, whatever color they are, could have one of the many forms of liver disease. So it's really grateful to be able to have that example, and I'm grateful that we got to him in time.
So with that, on to somebody else's news for the week.
Well, for us, the Patient-Focused Drug Development meeting was the news, being able to involve so many patients, to have the head of the division of hepatology and nutrition and many of the FDA staff there for the entire 5 hours was amazing to pull off. And the fact that my team not only rose to my challenge to have a PFDD meeting, but when I said, we should do 2 the next 12 months, because not only does NASH need one, but PBC needs one as well. So we'll be doing one for PBC in February. And so they said yes. And, we'll take the things that we learned from this one and apply it to the next one. But I could not be prouder of how my team worked, particularly my policy director, but my head of NASH, but the entire organization really pulled through to be able to do this. And I think they did it well. So the feedback has been positive. So I'm just really grateful for my team.
To our audience, the policy director in question is Andrew Scott, who we've met on the podcast a couple of times.
I'm not trying to get him stolen, so I didn't say his name. I was very intentional about that, Roger.
I think I'm interviewing him actually next week.
You do that at your peril.
All right. So Stephen, what's yours?
I guess I have 2 on personal note. I'm a big fan of Yellowstone, and last night was the season 4 debut and premiere, which didn't disappoint. I was very excited to see that. I have my own RIP, so it's nice to see him in action. Then on the professional side, I've recently had a lot of interest in starting up decentralized trials. This is in Terry's backyard. I've started to do this now in Houston. It has been met with an overwhelmingly positive response. The whole structure of this is actually going to the patient. So we do screening visits, randomization visits. Everything is done at the patient's bedside, at their home, nights, weekends, whatever's convenient for the patient. We use electronic data capture. It is phenomenal, the ability that we have to do these trials today, and heretofore has not yet made it into the liver world. I mean, there's a lot of decentralized trials going on, but it has not happened in the field of fatty liver for sure. I'm excited about where this is going. We're piloting it in Houston and hoping that it takes off, but so far so good.
That's fantastic to hear, Stephen. As someone who's been a proponent of decentralized trials for a long time, I just could not be more excited. If we're ever going to crack the code on really creating a culture of participation in clinical trials, we have to lower the barriers for people to participate in the flow of their life. Since most trials are for people with some disease, what it takes to get yourself together, to get out of the house, to go and wait. And that was before a pandemic. This realization that if we're going to be serious about clinical research, let alone diversity in clinical research, we really have to bring the research to the people rather than insist that people come to the research.
Thank you. It has beat my wildest expectations. As you said, patients are quick to jump on board because we don't have issues with PTO anymore. We don't have issues with transportation anymore. Those are all handled internally. Retention should be better on these trials.
Yeah, at some point, Stephen, when you're a little further into the game, I would love to do an episode on that, given that we started out a long time ago talking about clinical trials. It seems that circling back, what feels like it'll be 2 years later or close to it by the time we get there, would be really a wonderful thing once you've got data and some meta points to share. I would love that.
Sure.
All right. Terri.
This is going to be the 5th virtual meeting I've had, and actually in less than a week. And I guess one of the things that when I look at that is I go, okay, awareness is being raised. And that's been the key thing: education, awareness, encouraging others. One of those virtuals was actually being interviewed by a social media giant, and we'll leave it at that. So when you look at all the different things that are available, that was pretty huge for me, as it broke a record in my time with this.
That's a good record to break. Hopefully you'll be able to break it at least 7 more times before you're transplanted, then maybe at least 1 week a month after that for the next 20 years. Mine is kind of funny. Without going into the details, I have a family member dealing with a medical challenge, and I'm not going to say that everything's fine, but I'm going to say that he's off to as good a start as one could have hoped, and that when you deal with the medical system as a patient or as a family member advocate, instead of the way I've tended to do over my career, you really get to feel the heart of the medical system at its best, and the levels to which people rise selflessly in pursuit of doing what's right by patients. Now, in this case, it includes the doctor also, but I'm thinking more about nurses and different kinds of supporting people who've just gone so far above and beyond I can't describe. So what I say about the healthcare system in general is that they do miracles all the time, just not every time. I've got at least 7 people I didn't know 2 weeks ago to whom I will feel in gratitude for the rest of my life. And I think that's the healthcare system at its best. With that, let's transition from that to patient-focused drug development. And Donna, it would be great if you kick us off by just talking a little bit about the history and how this meeting came to be and what you were looking to accomplish when you put it together. Your floor.
Sure, thank you. There are a couple of ways to answer that question, but the history of patient-focused drug development, of these meetings in particular, is still very young. This was a result of some legislation called PDUFA 5. We're now several PDUFAs later. And so this was just created in 2012. We're the first patient-focused drug development meeting. And it was an attempt to have a more organized method for patients to be able to submit testimony, comments, other information that would be included in regulatory decision-making for drug development. So this was a very different model than patient advocates of past eras to chain themselves of a door of NIH or FDA, sort of a brokered settlement that patient voice wasn't a trend, and that the people who actually would be using the drug really should have a formal role in the process. You know, this very much went hand in hand with Congress creating statutes for FDA to be able to have patient representatives, members of the public, members who had relevant lived experience with the disease, to be voting members on advisory committees as well. These two developments, more than really any other, has driven all the other activities that we've seen, whether it's throughout pharmaceutical research, drug development, because the rubber hits the road of what FDA will and will not approve and what information they want to have as part of it. It was a huge development. So for the Global Liver Institute, created just, a few years later in 2014, really is just as me and some interns growing slowly. When we thought about what the needs were in the space and where my background intersected, certainly the policy arena and regulatory science was a clear need. And I've been an FDA patient representative for over a decade, serving on multiple advisory committees and endpoints workshops and things on risk mitigation and the like. This meeting in particular was something that I wish that we'd been able to do, which we have been a large enough organization to do 2 or 3 years ago. If we had been able to do that meeting, frankly, there would be a medication approved and on the market today. If people found value in this patient-focused drug development meeting in NASH, they really should think about the type of advocacy that we need moving forward and the investment in that advocacy, because it really does support and facilitate the entire space and really is the foundation upon which investment and innovation and access rests. And if we don't have that solid foundation in advocacy, then you can invent all you want, but it really won't have meaningful impact. And so after several adverse actions, not only in NASH, but across the liver space, we entered into conversations across FDA, certainly with the hepatology and nutrition division, which frankly, as an advocate, I had been part of the movement to make sure that FDA did have this division, did have hepatologists on staff, did have an increased capacity to evaluate medications in the liver space. But we wanted to make sure that there was a greater appreciation than we were seeing about the seriousness and urgency of liver health, whether that was in the hepatology division, the oncology division, in cardiovascular cardiovascular, renal, really across the agency. And I think because the Global Liver Institute really does look across liver health, across all liver diseases, we were able to see the pattern and present the pattern of adverse actions back to the agency in a way that, to their credit, they had sort of an aha moment. Because you can understand in any large organization, you may not really know what your colleague over in another division is doing. But when we put the entire picture together and presented as liver patients, and we brought in several other organizations with us, some of whom were founded by graduates of our Advanced Advocacy Academy, like Terri is, there was an aha moment and there was a realization. And I think we started a much more constructive relationship from then on, a series of regular conversations than the co-development of the meeting that we held last week. There are two types of meetings. There's one that FDA leads and runs and structures and organizes themselves, and another type, because there was so much interest from the patient community in doing these types of meetings, of externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. So my staff organized this meeting from soup to nuts, but stayed in regular contact and collaboration with FDA throughout. And our goal, first and foremost, was to create a platform for patient experiences that had a purpose, that really addressed each and every one of the issues that we had seen in the different FDA guidances and in their adverse letters and actions, or that we had heard or experienced in conversations or in presentations that we had made that we thought patients had a different view on, or patients would have a different perspective or weigh the risks and benefits of things differently than how the agency was assuming we would. And so until they could hear directly from a diverse group of people, as much as I would like to think it's enough that I say so, really to be able to prevent a diverse group of patient experiences who could comment on issues in their own words and from their own experiences, and then to augment that with a survey to get 50, 100 patients to be able to answer a series of questions and to give more structured and formatted data to the FDA to consider in their evaluation of trial design and medications and therapeutics of all sorts, whether it's diagnostics or devices. We really see NASH holistically, and we need them to think of it holistically, bringing in expertise in device and diagnostics, in cardiovascular and renal, metabolic disorders, endocrine from across the agency, and as needed externally to fairly evaluate NASH. We wanted to make sure that they understood from the patient perspective how serious NASH is, the urgency of NASH, and how patients viewed particular aspects of possible medications and therapeutics in the space. At the end of this meeting, there was greater clarity around that.
Okay, question, I think, first to Terri, who delivered several rather remarkably powerful statements, including your opening and a couple of your answers to questions. I'm an easy tell, my jaw just drops. Can you pick a couple of specific messages that you personally hope to be able to transmit to the agency over the course of the event?
Probably the key one is that if you've seen one NASH patient, you've seen one NASH patient. I mean, we may have some similarities as far as our decompensation if we've moved all the way to cirrhosis, but every patient is different, and the direction they came from may be different. It's so very important to put a face to a name, to be able to fully and completely be able to identify this as a person and not just a name or a number on a file. It's so easy to be separated. I told you all the other day, I'm a storyteller. In 2018, when I first met Donna, it was on a patient panel that happened right before Liver Meeting in San Francisco. And I had the opportunity of sitting down after this panel was through for the day and talking one-on-one with researchers from around the world. And the cool thing is their absolute amazement of getting to talk to a patient. And that blew my mind. They want to do good. They want to create something, but they had never really connected a patient with this disease to them. And they asked me questions like, how about your temperature? And I'm always cold. What about this? Nausea. What about that? And they were interested in hearing my story so that they could take that back to the lab and do more. They had a patient's face, a patient's voice attached to the reason why they were doing what they were doing. We had the chat feature that was part of the meeting on last Thursday. Seeing Dr. Turner say, my eyes have been opened, I'm going to do things different. That was huge when you look at that. When you look at some of the other things of, oh my gosh, you've opened my eyes. We could have we never knew. And now they do. And you can't unknow something.
Terri, were there one or two specific things, or Donna, that they came to know that you think are particularly pivotally important?
I think some of the unanimity. Each of the patient stories was very different. There were patient and caregivers. One young woman had lost her mother very precipitously to NASH, but the unanimity of the willingness to take certain risks or to experience some side effects, whether itchiness or weight gain or even increased cardiovascular risk controlled by statins, I think was surprising. Well, contrary to what they've stated was the patient preference or the risk-benefit analysis that they were making in lieu of having a direct patient input. And so hopefully that unanimity of view from those who know how serious NASH is and can be, that the value of stopping progression or certainly reversing disease was worth taking, we would before that meeting.
Steve and Louise, I don't know about you folks. I hear that comment and it kind of surprises me, because you would think this agency has been through this enough times with enough different patient groups that they would start to figure it out.
I think it's interesting. We say time and time again that it's about lack of progression, but the FDA always wants to reverse. And Manal's been very open about discussing that keeping a disease stable is actually a very good outcome for this. I just wonder, when I'm listening to Donna, I was listening to Terri's story and all of the patients that I've come across, and I don't know whether Stephen feels the same, is the fact that when you sit in front of a panel like the FDA, we are now in any form of cirrhosis, but particularly NASH, it is a catalogue of, and I'm going to be controversial here, system and health failures when we get to that level of disease and we didn't stop it, we didn't locate it, we didn't find it. Terri describes going to surgery and decompensating very quickly. Is there any excuse with the technologies and non-invasive methods we have today for anybody to go to surgery without knowing whether that person is cirrhotic? Because it will happen. So I just wonder, when the FDA faces that challenge, whether that's part of the issue. We do not believe that our health service could be so poor at picking up diseases. So I just wonder sometimes if we just get shocked by how did we get this far in patients' journeys. Terri described a lot of missed opportunities. That's polite. It's a big challenge for healthcare to turn around and acknowledge that when we deal with NASH cirrhosis or any form of liver cirrhosis, we've missed lots of opportunities from every specialist that's ever seen that or interacted with that person. But that's the overwhelming thinking that I've got behind this change or potential change, to know that an outcome could just be, I don't want my disease to progress. I want you to keep me stable.
Right. And I think that coming from the other part of the GI system with IBD before my liver transplant, I'm only alive today because I've stayed one step behind the innovation. I've now been on every class of drugs that has ever been created in IBD, and hope not to need another class, but I hope that it's there if I should need it. And often it's just been about buying me enough time until something better or more effective comes along. I look at, the young women in the infusion center getting their biologics, and they're otherwise so vibrant, and so many of them are pregnant, and I am so happy for them, and I'm grateful for the drugs that I had, and I know that they allowed me to hang on until there was something better. And so I think in NASH, that's an important part of the patient expectations and value and evaluation of the situation too, that we're not expecting a cure, certainly not right off the bat from the first treatment on the market. We have nothing and we need something, and then we anticipate, because that's the history of drug development, that they will continue to improve on those, or there will be additional medications that address other mechanisms and aspects. I think that's another area where the patient expectations of the drug process and the regulatory expectations of treatments has diverged, and so I hope that's something that we have corrected and can continue to correct in conversations moving forward so that they align.
About a year after I was diagnosed diagnosed, I went and talked to my primary care physician. He had mentioned that he was going to be opening up a diabetic clinic as a part of their clinical practice. And so I went to him and I said, okay, let's talk. If you're going to open this as an opportunity, not just in managing diabetes, but in actually is going the whole process, then I'm going to challenge you is at the same time that you're doing this is to also screen for liver disease as well. Get a FibroScan, get somebody on staff that understands what's going on with the liver. Have a team of doctors that you can refer very quickly. You don't have to be the specialist on it, but you do need to know who you can send them to. Because there is a responsibility for as soon as something is seen. I know how to read my scans now. I should have never gone into surgery, honestly. And that's looking at the ones before. There were signs, and I know what those signs are now, but I didn't back then. But somebody should have caught it.
Thank goodness we have International NASH Day to raise that awareness with primary care and all the other specialists. As I said in the meeting, we do want to present challenges to the agency that are within their regulatory scope, and I feel that that's outside of it. I am appreciative that they have worked with the NIMBLE Consortium and are involved in non-invasive diagnostics, because that's an important part of this too, as we all know. I don't think that the story of NASH or story of NASH drug development can be or should be disconnected from the development of diagnostics. There are several friends of the podcast like Dr. Sanyal who have hands-on training and tours and presentations to FDA staff about non-invasive diagnostics so that they understand that better, because I think that that is part and parcel of being able to understand the story of NASH and to evaluate treatments for it. It's really about understanding a host of factors, even just within the regulatory environment, to be able to put any drug development program in context.
So, question to Stephen, I guess. Fundamentally, different parts of the meeting focused on what people were willing to risk to take drugs, and conversely, what they weren't willing to risk around biopsy because of concerns about biopsy and the availability, they hoped and believed, of better options. If you had to pick one, which one do you think is more important to see progress made on quickly? I'm going to ask everyone that question. I'm starting with you because I know we're going to lose you in a few minutes.
Well, there's a lot that you could look at here. Obviously, at the end of the day, it's about patient preference. While I've done probably 10,000 liver biopsies in my career, when I look in the mirror and say, would I want to do a liver biopsy on myself or have somebody do a liver biopsy on me? The answer is no, particularly not by a first-year fellow. I don't know how we ever trained those fellows to do the first couple. Those are some brave patients, no doubt. We all want to have something that is less invasive and more specific. I think we have very good sensitive non-invasive tests to exclude disease, but where we lack is the precision to appropriately stage patients with NASH. And we are rapidly moving in that direction. Some NITs are further along than others. I think MRE and CT1 from an MR perspective are really kind of showing us some opportunity to both diagnose and prognosticate patients. ELF is now approved for its prognosis. I think the next step is really what we're hoping to do at NASH Tag, and that is bring everybody together, have a fireside chat, and really talk about what's it going to take to get to an NIT as a diagnostic and as prognostic, so that we don't have to have liver biopsy. It's not that it's just an invasive procedure, it's just not very good at telling us the extent of liver injury when you're only looking at 1/50,000th of it, and oh, by the way, you're really only looking at 1/12th of the 50,000th because you're leaving the majority of the tissue block behind, and you're looking at 1 H&E and 1 trichrome, which, as you know, Roger, I'm a big advocate of looking at more of that block to make a decision about really what's happening in the liver. And then my final thought to Terri's comment earlier, and even Donna's, the surprise from the FDA. I think the FDA is trying to do a great job. They're trying to do drug development in such a way that they minimize risk. But what we also need is to maximize benefit. And there is a happy median. The enemy of good is great. Do we need great? No, we need something. So let's kind of find a way that we can get there. And this always comes back to a question I get asked, and having Terri and Donna and Louise here I think is terrific, because one of the questions I always get asked is, what are patients willing to take? An injectable with AEs, or do they have to have an oral that's well tolerated with no adverse events? And that's a question I get asked. I'm not a patient. I can just kind of think about what my patients are likely to say. And my thought is always, the juice has to be worth the squeeze. If you you has to be worth the climb. If you've got bad disease, you're willing to take, more, the route of administration can be a bit more challenging, and the side effect profile can be a little bit bigger because you're really trying to stop that freight train from going over the cliff. Alternatively, if you have mild disease and you're asymptomatic and you got time on your side, let's try to find a more palatable therapy that's well tolerated, oral, and that sort of thing. That's my perception. And of course, I leave that to Terri and Donna and the team to give their input in, but that's my thoughts.
Okay, Louise?
I absolutely agree with Stephen. Also, Stephen said multiple times that an anecdote of a patient sitting in front of you will prompt you a lot to remember and to do things. And it's worth more literature. It's worth more than anything. So I think he's right. It's what individuals will take. And again, I've not been a patient. When we talk about what we need now for medication, we also need to be discussing with people who may not have the disease yet. Where does the future take us? What do you want in the future? Because people diagnosed today were non-patients 10 or 15 years ago. Technologies move on. So what we decide today may not be where we are in 5 or 10 years' time. So we do need to have a broader aspect of what we want to tolerate. If it was me, it would be things like, going forward, a nasal spray, something that can be taken by most people in different mechanisms. How easy can we make it? What are we trying to achieve? How can it be absorbed? But Stephen's right. I've never come across a patient with severe disease who hasn't been willing to do more or less anything. But Donna and Terri will have way better insight.
Well, I think it's also not just people with severe disease, people who have had the conversation with their physicians about what the path is, what the complications and consequences of diseases, what their future could look like if their disease isn't at least slowed down. So we find in conversations with those patients, there's a level of risk too. It's a benefit risk, it's a calculation. It's always in context. It's not just in a vacuum. I'll give a real quick additional example to help bring this home to people from another disease state. I have, after this many years post-transplant, I have anemia chronic disease. I have a friend who does as well, and she was having trouble getting her EPO, which I had recently benefited from great access to medical care. I'd had my erythropoietin shot, I'd had my IV iron, and I was feeling great, beating Peloton personal records. But we were trying to explain to our friends, even one who was a physician on our daily text thread, what patients have to go through to get access to this and how tight the target range is. And when I went back to look at the actual label, it says the lowest dose sufficient to avoid a transfusion. I was like, is that supposed to be the goal? Because that's not my goal. That's not my friend's goal. It's the lowest dose necessary to leave a full and functional life is our target for getting this drug. And so there's that divergence again about what are the endpoints, the language, the goals from a research, from a physician, from a regulatory perspective, and what patients actually want of their therapeutics. And so we have to continue having strong advocacy organizations, strong patients like Terri who can articulate their stories so well and so strategically, patient-focused drug development meetings, ongoing conversations between patients, patient advocates, and regulators to bring these closer in alignment. Because even for those of us with very low cardiovascular risk to be told that our goal is just to avoid having a transfusion, I know what it's like living when you need a transfusion versus living where I am right now today. That's a wide gulf. That's not my goal. This is my goal, and this is where we need everybody.
So, Stephen, I know you said you have to jump. If you got to jump, jump. Donna, I have to tell you, every time I deal with institutional medicine in situations like this, I'm struck by, this is me being controversial, the paternalism of their point of view. They believe if you really knew what you were asking for, you wouldn't ask for it because it's much more dangerous than you know.
And I say, if you really knew what it was like to live one day as me, you wouldn't question why I'm asking for it.
So let me share a story. My mom, in her mid-50s, developed rheumatoid arthritis, fairly severe rheumatoid arthritis, and had 15 brutal years. My dad had left, she was alone, and disease was erosive and progressive, and nothing she could do about it. And then the anti-TNFs came along. And we had, she and I, a very long conversation about the anti-TNFs and the idea that they might provide relief, but that they would leave her susceptible to common infection that she probably couldn't stop. She looked at me and said, if I get one more good year, I don't care what happens at the end of it. And it turned out that she got 5. And in the end, a stupid stinking strep pneumonia killed her. I've never questioned for a second that knowing the risk that she was walking into, she comfortably walked right into it. Okay, Terri, we didn't tell everybody that Terri was gone as compared to Stephen, who we knew had to leave. But Terri was gone, is back. So welcome. We're happy to have you. Now, that's not the only example like that I can think of. But everything you're talking about is the same thing, which is an inability to be empathic from a position of supposed knowledge superiority. I'm not going to say intellectual superiority. I'm just saying knowledge. I know more. If you knew what I know, ... as compared to experiential sensitivity.
But it's not unlike the argument that always gets posed. What about the false positives? If you diagnose somebody with a disease, which we've covered on here, is that ultimately that's a cop-out because that's the minority. And I'd rather investigate something that turns out to be nothing than not investigate nothing that turns out to be something.
What would happen if there was a false positive of fatty liver disease, that I would, start exercising and eating better and watching taking my statins and my diabetes medication for nothing? That doesn't seem like a horror story to me.
You've got to say, it's one of the best healthy options, isn't it?
It would be traumatic. The psychological harm just should not be allowed by any IRB.
Nobody gets used time and time and time again to obstruct the cost of putting in these things. Because it's a real concern, the false positives and the false negatives. I've been more concerned about the false negative than the false positive, but I don't know where that really, really comes from. Because as you say, in any form of the majority of liver diseases, it's improve your lifestyle, improve the fitness, improve the levels, and that will help whatever other disease you've got because it reduces the cofactor. Donna's right. If that's the worst advice you're ever going to be given by a physician, let's give it.
And it's not that anybody gets better with diet and exercise because they're fearful, right? People always do this for the most upbeat and optimistic reasons, he said facetiously.
Roger, bring us home on this.
Okay, I think home is a really simple question, which is you guys took a huge step last week. And the realness of the conversations and the courage of the people who spoke. I don't cry very often. I was in tears twice. I don't cry very often at moments that really resonate personally. And this resonated personally enough that I was in tears twice with two people I'd never met before. One of whom happens to be on a podcast today, Terri. What's the one thing each of us, most importantly each of the two of you, hopes to see come out of this next? Because over time, I think we know the laundry list, but what's the one thing you want to see next?
In dealing with thousands of patients on a daily basis, on the different people that I speak to, encourage, love on, kind of try to lead, sometimes kicking and screaming, me screaming, not them, but is to have something that slows down the progression, that stops the progression actually, and at this point in time, it's not even about a cure, is just to have something in hand that we can hand to somebody and say, okay, with lifestyle modification and this, that will stop the progression and maybe even reverse it, maybe go back to F1 or F2. I think that would be viable.
I've written down a few comments, and one of them was exactly what Donna said. We've got nothing at the moment, so we just need something to slow that progression down. I think we've had OCA sitting in the background here for now nearly 15 months since the FDA delayed all of that, even if that just slows it down. I agree, we need something to hold at the moment for lots of patients, and the FDA need to bend a little bit, and I think maybe we might get there. But yeah, we need something for right now so that we can hold on for something better in the future.
Just so that we don't all sound boring and say the same thing without knowing what Donna's going to say. Beyond the we need something is I want to go into two specific dimensions of why that is. One is hope. That we know that people with hope strive harder to do the things they can do and last longer. So if hope gets people to take better care of themselves while using medications that aren't working that well but are better, or have a hope for something to come up, from the patient point of view, hope in itself is huge, number one. And number two, Terri was telling me on our pre-conversation, and not the only time I've ever heard this, but the only time I heard this morning, about all the doctors who didn't know what they were dealing with. And one of the things that happens when you get a drug to market, this may not be the way you'd want it to be in a pristine world, but where we live is real, is most of the education comes out of pharma, and it comes out of the moments when there are drugs to treat. So when I think of everything that Intercept was using a year and a half ago, the educational things that they were going to use with physicians that you could see at meetings before that CRL letter came out, it's not a great drug, but it works sometimes, and it offers hope. And patients were willing to get through the side effects. And the simple act of educating doctors so that people didn't have the problems that you guys had years ago and are going on today, because nobody's nobody's teaching anybody. We're worth the price of admission. So, and actually, Donna, that's changed. If you'd asked me that question at the beginning of last week, I would have told you the diagnostics were more important than the drugs. But having listened to you guys Thursday and having been through what I went through last week and thought about it a little bit, talking to Terri today, I think getting a drug is actually, I agree with you, the most important thing we could do right now, and the hope that goes along with it.
It's not the answer that I think people are expecting. So certainly, I hope that this does advance the development of therapeutics of all categories. But I think that the big takeaway from last week is there is patient accountability of the regulatory space in liver health, that there is nothing that the agency can do or not do in liver health that isn't being scrutinized and that will go unanswered or unaddressed. So what will they do now? My expectation is that it will be more across the board for treatments and various methods of addressing all forms of liver disease across not only this division, but across the agency. And I think that this is the beginning of a new era for liver health, hopefully for liver research and investment in liver research, because that patient voice, that patient accountability, that patient scrutiny and proactive response and partnership, should the agency take advantage of that, and I think they will. They've been very responsive as part of this process, will make a difference for everything to come later.
Hoping that you'll have that, because A, that makes complete sense to me. B, that is the role of advocates, is to drive that point of view. And C, if it goes the path you're talking about, you actually might win did we need the kind of fiery advocates that they had in ACT UP in order to make this go forward? You might not need outside bomb throwers if you can pull this off.
Across the history of advocacy, we needed that at that time. And there's often a place, even now, for what I call sort of Goldilocks method of advocacy. Somebody too hot, somebody too cold. And so they end up dealing with somebody just right. And GLI usually ends up being just right.
And specifically, I guess I'm going back about 10 months to a conversation.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I don't forget.
No, I didn't.
Well,
no, I knew you didn't. This was me saying, if you can pull this off, you were right.
Knowing look for those who are listening only to the podcast.
Well, there are a couple of others who I'm going to have to send this episode to and see if they agree with me on that. But
time will tell.
Time will tell. All right. With that, Terri, thank you for enlightening me twice today and 3 times in a week. I feel enriched by having gotten to know you in the last week and to listen to you in the last week. Donna, I feel enriched every time I talk to you. Louise, likewise. And thanks to Stephen, although he's not here anymore. We will be covering AASLD Sunday night, Monday night, and we'll do a wrap-up episode on Tuesday that we'll post on Thursday. And the week after that, you guys are in for a treat. Jeff Lazarus is coming back to talk about the global consensus document on NAFLD, a very, very important piece of work. Frankly, I'm thrilled that as soon as it came out, Jeff reached out and said, gee, you need to take a look at this, and then was willing to make time that quickly to come on. That's my Thanksgiving week gift. So I'll be back in a minute with the business report. Thank you, all you folks, and audience, stay with me, okay? Thanks. Bye-bye now.
Welcome to today's episode 54 business section.
That was really a different episode. I hope everybody was as touched by it as I was. And I will dive straight into business issues now because we have a decent amount of stuff to cover.
Next week is AASLD's The Liver Meeting DX 2021. Here is our schedule and some exciting news.
As I mentioned last week, we will record episodes right after the sessions close on Sunday and Monday. That'll be 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time recording, and we'll release lightly edited versions of these by the following morning. Stephen cannot join us Sunday, although Louise will be joining us at 11:30 p.m. British Winter Time. She's my hero. But we are fortunate to have Scott Friedman, Nainal Corey, and Michelle Long with us that evening. Stephen joins Louise and me on Monday, and Mazen Noureddin and Michael Charlton are our guests. And we will tape our wrap-up episode Tuesday at our normal mid-afternoon time, 3:15 or 3:30 Eastern, which is far more sane for our European friends. So for that episode, Stephen, Louise, and I will be joined by Jorn Schattenberg and Ian Rowe from Europe, along with Manal Abdulmalik, fresh from doing the NAFLD wrap-up talk the day before. My exciting news is that we will be able to admit live audiences for all 3 sessions, as we did for EASL. If we have your email address from the EASL live sessions, expect an invitation within the next day or 2 with links for the meetings. If you did not attend but heard about how well these went and how much people liked listening in real time, watch out for an email email if you're a subscriber, or a post with a link if you're a LinkedIn follower of SurfingNASH or HepDynamics. To help us control crowd size, we're asking everyone who wants to attend live to give us an email address to which we can send a link, but we will do that if you connect to us in any of the ways I just described. Quick reminder after that, in 2 weeks, Jeff Lazarus and a couple of the co-authors will join us to discuss the recent, very important consensus statement advancing the global public health agenda for NAFLD that appeared in Nature Review's Gastro and Hepatology a couple of weeks ago.
This week's numbers are 6 and 400.
You folks continue to amaze and delight us with your interest. 6th refers to the consecutive weeks that the 28-day rolling IAB certified download count has been over 3,000, a number it never reached before that. And 400 is a barrier that we broke last week when the Paris NASH conversation that Stephen and Jorn did on the imaging talks from Lars Johansson and Scott Friedman collected its 400th download. Before this episode, the highest had been 313. At the end of Monday, that number stood at 404. For the time being, we're going to keep discussing our vault oldie but goodie episodes at the end of the business report instead of putting out a print version, so here goes.
So, Roger, what's in the vault this week?
This week's Vault report doesn't sound much like last week's, except that Paris NASH imaging conversation 46.2 gained another 52 downloads the week after it gained 600. We've never seen anything like this in the history of the podcast. Beyond that, in the Real Oldies category, Season 1, Episode 24, our wrap-up of EASL 2020, gained a handful of users last week, more than the one or two that you see dribbling and drabbing through, as did Season 2, Episode 21, our summary of Day 1 of the 4th Global NASH Congress in April. Now, that day included mostly non-invasive diagnostics and regulatory discussion. Among our more recent episodes, Scott Friedman's episode 51 is continuing on the pace I mentioned last week, and Lars Johansson's episode 50 and the 3 KOLs, Ian Rowe, Michelle Long, and Manal Abdelmalek, discussing their most interesting stories of summer in episode 47, each outpaced what we expect from a podcast at that point in its aging. Those are my vault goodies. And with that, I want to finish by thanking our exceptional team, Mike Wilson, our engineer, Eric Round, social media, Steve Ennen, data management, and our two fantastic guests, Donna Cryer, who always energizes and is amazing and inspiring every time she's with us, and Terri Milton, a storyteller par excellence who touched all of us with her courage and dignity and her story. Finally, I want to thank all you folks who keep coming back every week and bring friends with you because we keep growing and provide the energy and inspiration for us to do this every week. Next week, in fact, 3 times. So, as I say, next week is a big week for SurfingNASH, 3 AASLD episodes, perhaps some shorter interviews, all done live. So stay safe, surf on. We'll see you next week, 3 times, I hope, on the podcast, and maybe some of them live. Bye-bye now.
Have any questions for the surfers? You can send them to surfingnash.com, and we will answer on the podcast or the website.